So hello and welcome to this Politico live event. I'm Anna Isaac, UK Trade and Economics correspondent for Politico here in London. I'm joined by all you lovely people across Zoom, Facebook and our website, and of course, International Trade Secretary Liz Truss. Thank you so much for being here today, Secretary.
Great to be here, Anna.
Now, we are going to be focusing on trade, but as I'm sure you're aware, it's been a day of extraordinary drama in Westminster with some very serious allegations from Dominic Cummings, one of the most senior advisors to the PM until he left office. Now, I want to start with a question of addressing perhaps one of the most serious points we've heard today, which was that Health Secretary Matt Hancock was a liar. And I'm going to address sort of a very serious point that Dominic Cummings suggests he lied about, and I'm going to quote him here. We were told categorically in March that people would be tested before they went back to homes. He's referring to care homes. We only subsequently found out that that hadn't happened. Now, for people who aren't familiar, there was a very serious problem with people being discharged from hospitals, having tested positive for COVID, and then causing serious outbreaks in those residential homes. So Secretary of State, I'd like to ask you as a member of the government to address that point. Is Matt Hancock a liar? And if he isn't, then what went wrong?
Well, as you can appreciate, Anna, given that we're currently in the middle of negotiations with Australia, we've had a meeting of the Ottawa Group of Trade Ministers today, and I'm working very hard to prepare for G7 over the next 2 days. I haven't had any time to engage with these allegations. What I will say is that Matt Hancock is an excellent colleague who's doing a very good job in what has been a very tough global pandemic.
Okay, I would just ask you one more time to address the issue of people testing positive for COVID being discharged into care homes, because while I absolutely appreciate and have plenty of trade questions to ask you, some of these people will have been your constituents, and you are, of course, a constituency MP, a member of cabinet, as well as having this very important trade role. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
I'm not going to engage with the false claims that have been made today. What I will say is that the government's been working flat out, first of all, to deal with the COVID crisis, and of course on the vaccination programme, which now means a third of adults in the UK have been fully vaccinated. And that's what our focus is on, not engaging with this testimony that's taken place today. And I certainly, as Trade Secretary with a lot on my plate, haven't had time to look at it yet.
Okay, well, thank you so much for addressing those points. It's much appreciated. So let's turn to some easy trade questions. Let's start with China. Now, you said last week, of course, that Britain had been too soft on China for too long. And I wondered if you could expand on that point and explain some of your thinking.
When the World Trade Organization was set up in 1995, China was a tenth the size of the US economy. We're now in a position where China is much more economically powerful, and yet it's still classed as a developing country, according to the self-designation, but according to the World Trade Organization. And there have been many practices, whether it's forced technology transfer, IP violations, or unfair industrial subsidies that haven't been transparently declared, where a blind eye has been turned, in my view, for too long, not just by the UK and the EU, but by the rest of the world. And I'm determined to work with like-minded partners to make the rules of the WTO work, and also to make those rules tougher. Because if people don't have faith that the trade we're engaging in is fair, they will lose faith in free trade. And that's very important to me. Free trade, has been a hugely positive force, lifting millions of people out of poverty, improving everyday lives across the world. But we have to fight to make sure it's properly rooted in fair trade.
Absolutely. And as you're very aware, some of your parliamentary colleagues are facing sanctions from China at the moment. So would you say that that's toughened your stance as well? So the wider political situation as well as the important trade context, because of course you have to pull together the trade strategy with also a security focused mindset too.
Well, I stand by my colleagues who have faced this appalling treatment by China. And of course, we have seen horrific things taking place in Xinjiang, We've seen the issues over Hong Kong, and my colleague, the Foreign Secretary, has been very much dealing with that and taking action on that. But to me, as well as those specific violations, there's a broader issue here about economic coercion and the use of economic power to achieve things. And it is right that democratic countries within the WTO and our allies who believe in following the rules do seek to get changes to the way the organization works. And I think now is the right time. We've got a new Director General, Dr. Ngozi, who's incredibly energetic. We've got a new administration in the US who want to work with other countries, and we really do need to make the WTO work fairly. So yes, there are clearly issues with China and with the sanctions that have been placed on my colleagues. But fundamentally, this is an issue about making the global trading system work and giving people faith that the rules are being followed.
There's really interesting points about how to address it as at a multilateral level. I wonder, though, if you could address the point of a sort of a bilateral relationship, particularly looking at investment, and tell me whether or not you have received any pressure at all from Number 10 or other cabinet colleagues to try and pursue a more open dialogue with your trade counterparts in China.
We believe in trade as a force for good, and of course we continue to trade with China. It's an important market for our exports. There is Chinese investment in the United Kingdom. I think the key thing is about not becoming dependent and making sure that we have a multitude of trading partners. That's one of the reasons why it's so important that we're striking new trade deals with the likes of CPTPP, working with other parts of the world. I've just recently launched the consultation on India. So it's important that we aren't dependent on investment or exports or imports from a particular part of the world. And it's also important, and this has been done recently by my colleague Kwasi Kwarteng, that we do look at investments through the light of security as well, and that we're not endangering our national security through the investments in the UK.
Thank you so much. And turning to another pretty important player in global trade, the US, are you where you hoped to be at this point in terms of US trading relations? What are your key priorities in the next 6 months, year? When do you see there being a full free trade agreement or making progress on resolving the Airbus-Boeing dispute or the 232 steel tariffs?
Well, we have a very positive relationship with the United States. They're a key trading partner. They're our number one single country bilateral trading partner. I'm delighted that we've seen the tariffs lifted on products like whiskey, and we're in serious negotiations at the moment with the United States to resolve the Airbus-Boeing dispute, which has gone on for 16 years. I'm also raising the issue of the 232 tariffs, because we've just been talking about security. I don't think it's right that we have tariffs against the UK steel industry when we're a close ally of the United States. And those discussions are also part of our bilateral work to challenge unfair trading practices around the world. We've been talking specifically about China and making sure that we are working together with like-minded allies like the United States. We are in official level discussions about the future free trade agreement negotiations. I'm confident that a deal is the right thing for both the UK and the US. It will help cement our recovery from COVID, but also it will help set high standards that we want to see others around the world adopt. So I think it is an important agreement. We need to take the time to get it right. Of course, there's a new administration who are looking at the detail, but it makes strategic sense for both the UK and the US to do this deal.
Absolutely. There is a bit of a disconnect on timelines, perhaps. A question I really wanted to ask you was, could you see a deal happening before the 2022 midterms, for instance?
I'm not making predictions about a timeline. I think that's always a dangerous game. Sometimes deadlines can help focus minds, but at this stage, what we're doing is working on what the components would be and making sure that we are aligned on some of the key issues, namely Airbus, Boeing, and the 232 disputes. I think those are the immediate issues we're focusing on. And we don't want to do a deal that isn't right just to hit a specific deadline. However, I do think there's a strategic and economic interest from both countries in doing the deal, and I'm confident things are moving in the right direction.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you so much. Now, one point that you've discussed often is the wins you achieved in deals like Japan, where you talk about business labor mobility, so allowing business people to move more easily between countries. But looking at recent events and recent reports from my colleagues here at Politico on immigration in the UK, there have been questions raised about how friendly an environment the UK has become for people travelling here to seek work or to, for instance, have a job interview. Is there a risk that the UK is becoming a bit of a hostile environment for foreign workers? How would you sum up your ambitions for UK immigration insofar as it touches on trade?
I mean, what we've seen with our new points-based immigration system is more migration in particular areas. So, for example, we've seen a huge rise in the number of Indian students attending UK universities. We introduced the 2-year post-study work visa. And of course, in our trade negotiations, we're looking to get better access for British business people into overseas markets. And often these arrangements are reciprocal. And of course, that helps us with services trade. It's a key strength for the United Kingdom. I want us to be a hub for services and digital trade. We're the second largest services exporter in the world. And of course, strong mobility arrangements are a key part of that.
Is that a bit of a battle, though, getting those stronger mobility arrangements with some of your cabinet colleagues who want to take a harder line on immigration than yourself?
I work very cooperatively with the Home Secretary. She is a great supporter of trade and making sure that we get the right arrangements in our trade deals. And this is all, we can talk about leaving the EU and the Brexit vote, but one of the key reasons people wanted to do that is so that we have proper control over our immigration and migration. And Priti Patel has restored that in the UK system, which means that we can work on mobility arrangements in trade deals in a clear-sighted way.
Brilliant. And just one question before we turn, and I can see the questions coming through on the Q&A function on Zoom. So thanks very much to all of our audience for sending those in. But if we could just turn to, because I know it's a big part of your week, a very busy week for you on trade, as you've pointed out, could you tell us a little bit about what to expect from the G7 meetings, for the trade track meetings?
So we've laid out our objectives for the trade track as, first of all, of being about fair and free trade. So we want to improve the industrial subsidies regime at the World Trade Organization to deal with unfair practices. We want to get the organization moving again, dealing with some of the internal issues like the dispute settlement system. And we also want to look at making sure that there is a strong future roadmap for the World Trade Organization. The other point I'd make is the WTO was set up, before the first COP meeting had taken place. So we need to make sure carbon and carbon leakage are a feature of future WTO rules. And also digital is a key part of what we need to get a more digital embedded into the way that the World Trade Organization works. So we're working with G7 allies on those issues. We're making progress. We've got this meeting this week. We'll have a further meeting in October. And what we want to do is help lay the groundwork for a successful MC12 conference in Geneva. I think this is going to be a really important time for the global trading system, showing that the WTO can work, it can make progress, it can succeed in closing negotiations and moving forward after a number of years of hiatus. So that is the aim of the G7 trade track, is to support Dr. Ngozi in those reform efforts. In addition to that, we're also working very hard to make sure healthcare products and vaccines are flowing freely and that we're increasing capacity, particularly on vaccines. And that will be another part of the discussion over the next few days.
Vaccines have, of course, been an issue along with immigration and the detention of EU nationals, where we've seen relations between the EU and UK sour even further from how they were left by some disagreements surrounding Brexit. So I'm just wondering how you're finding engaging with the EU on addressing multilateral issues like WTO reform when we keep seeing these very public rows over matters like fishing, detention, etc.
Well, I have a very frequent discussions with Valdis Dombrovskis. We share a lot of similar outlooks on some of the key issues at the WTO. We want to see resolution to the dispute settlement system. We want to see action to address industrial subsidies. We're interested in how the issue of climate change can be better reflected at the WTO. So, of course, there are issues we discuss with the EU over the TCA agreement. Lord Frost leads on that. But in terms of the WTO, the EU are a key part of making the organisation work, and we're keen to work with them in areas where we share common objectives.
Thank you very much. Now, there's so many questions are coming through, so we must get to them, and I must stop being greedy with your time and give the audience a chance. So we have Rosa Crawford here, the question from the Trade Unions Congress, TUC. She says it's welcome that DIT is engaging with trade unions regularly, and we hope to see trade unions consulted on the text of negotiations. How is that going? How is the engaging with groups on the text, the actual text of negotiations going? Because you have had some groups, and of course you've had the Trade and Agriculture Commission, but we have seen some tensions from sort of groups within society about how trade deals are handled. How are you trying to sort of show the benefits, say, to farmers, for instance, who've been very upset by some of the quota-free, tariff-free access that seems to be on the table in Australia talks? How are you going to sort of make good on the Global Britain trade promise to everyone and keep them engaged and informed along the way so there can be proper scrutiny?
That's a very long series of questions.
Let me boil it down. How are you going to convince people of the benefits of Global Britain?
So we've got trade advisory groups in all of the specialist areas, including food and agriculture. We've also got a trade union advisory group. And those groups are consulted on the details of our negotiation. Importantly, those groups are under NDAs because what we can't have is the details of our negotiating position leaking out so that the people we're negotiating with find out our positions. And that is always the tension inherent in negotiating trade deals, is that we don't want our position to be exposed, not just to our current negotiating partners, but also to future negotiating partners. So we do hold that very tight. We do engage industry closely. We do engage trade unions closely, though, to make sure that we are working in line with what they want. Because ultimately, the reason I'm striking trade deals is to help British business, British consumers, and improve our overall position in terms of our economy. So we do need to consult in detail with those industries. Of course, there is then a scrutiny process we go through with Parliament, but that takes place once we've got to the position of a signed deal. So in terms of Australia, we are looking to get to agreement in principle in June, but it'll be a while longer before we have fully stable text and a signed deal. We're expecting that this autumn, and at that point it will go through the parliamentary scrutiny process, it will go through the Trade and Agriculture Commission process, so that MPs have the full information before it goes through the constitutional reform and governance process. But it's obviously very difficult during a live negotiation to have those discussions in public because it simply informs our negotiating counterparts. I mean, on the subject of Australia and agriculture, I want to be very clear that we are looking to strike a deal that benefits Britain's farmers. And we're looking very closely at all of the aspects of the deal in those negotiations. It's already the case that Australian lamb isn't competitive in the UK. I'm fully of the view that our beef industry can and will compete. And Australia is also an important gateway to the CPTPP. When you look at where the opportunities are for British beef and lamb, they lie in markets like Asia. There's rapidly growing demand. We're expecting trade with the CPTPP to grow by 65% by 2030. We're expecting the majority of the world's middle classes to be in those areas. So we do have to look outward about where the opportunities are for our beef and lamb farmers, and they very much lie in opening up those markets, particularly in the Far East.
Thank you very much. And what sort of timeline? I know you're reluctant to put deadlines on things for many reasons, because there are lots of moving parts with trade. But what about CPTPP? When do you see the UK becoming a full member of CPTPP?
Well, we're planning to start negotiations later this spring. Again, I don't want to put an exact deadline, but I do think this will not be a terribly long process because the CPTPP text is already in place. It's a high standards agreement. It's in the UK's interest to sign up to this agreement because it does bring lots of benefits in terms of making sure other countries follow the rules. I mean, talking about British farming again, our products have been locked out of markets for years, like the US, and have only just gone back in. So it's really in our interest to sign up to these agreements that protect our exports into those markets. But the negotiations will obviously involve a central negotiation with the CPTPP bloc and 11 separate market access negotiations. So it will take some time, but because it's an existing agreement, it's obviously less of a process than the Australian deal, for example, where we've been negotiating that from scratch.
So this actually, the way you describe that actually touches on a question I received via email. So are you going to open up your bilateral discussions with Australia and say New Zealand, which could conceivably get over the line before the timeline you lay out with CPTPP? Are you doing once and done, or are you planning to open up the envelope again when you go through the rounds with them?
I will be saying more about that in due course. You won't be expecting me to reveal my internal negotiating positions on these issues.
I live in hope. I live in hope. But thanks very much for addressing it anyhow. One question we're getting, and it's something we hear about a lot. I particularly hear it when I speak to young people. How do you incorporate environmental concerns into trade deals? I hear it again and again and again, particularly from younger people who are very concerned about the climate emergency. How do you go about uniting sort of the big forces of commerce with the big forces of net zero? How do you deal with that? What is sometimes a contradiction?
I don't believe it is a contradiction. I think the more income we generate, the more we give ourselves the ability to actually find the technology and deal with climate change. And it's a key principle in all of our trade negotiations that we will do nothing to jeopardize the UK's net zero target. We're obviously working very hard at the moment through the COP process to get other countries to sign up to the net zero target. And the point I was making earlier about the World Trade Organization is I believe that is the right place to embed some of these issues about carbon to make sure that global trade is not contributing to carbon leakage as net zero targets tighten up. So the UK is really at the forefront of arguing for a multilateral approach to how we deal with carbon leakage to make sure that is factored into the global trading system.
And we probably just have time for just one more question, because I know you have a hard stop at 6 p.m, so I'm very eager not to keep you too long. If we could turn to the matter of, you've addressed it briefly, but you've said you want global Britain and being more open economy to generate jobs. You're often selling this simple message of trade equals jobs. Is there a step in between that that you think you need to explore more with your colleagues in Treasury or in BEIS about sort of upskilling people, because the UK economy may have to reshape itself to try and meet the needs of other markets and have to deal with greater competition in certain areas as a result of trade deals?
There are 6.5 million people working for jobs in exporting industries, and we think we can raise that number. And the point about trade is, first of all, it's directly benefiting those industries and export, but also opening up your market to ideas and innovation makes our country better and makes it more successful. And when you look at protectionist countries that protect particular industries, those industries don't succeed in the long term because they're not open to new ideas, they're not open to new innovation and new ways of doing things. So, of course, we need to look at things like transition periods to make sure industries are able to adjust. We need to make sure that we have strong support for exporters, because there are barriers, there are doors that the government can open. We need to make sure that we are, creating the skills that are needed, and that is work that the DFE and BEIS are doing. But there's not an option of just suddenly closing your country to the rest of the world and hoping for the best. That is the way to penury. And Britain, in my view, has always been at its best when we've been a free trading nation. I'm proud, that we're the country that abolished the Corn Laws and led the free trade revolution. And I think we've got a real opportunity to do that again in areas like digital and services, where the UK is one of the leaders in the world.
Thank you so much. And I suppose I should get close to wrapping up. It's always, you either leave it too late and there isn't time to wrap up, or you do it too soon and you miss out on the last chance for any questions. But I think given your hard stop at 6, we should probably leave it there. But I think sort of the main lessons I've taken away from today's session is that you think there's a fine line to walk on China, both on a bilateral and multilateral basis. You're optimistic for a US deal, but you're not sure when it might come off, but you're hoping that conversations continue to be cordial. So thank you so much for your time and the audience's time this evening. And if you want to send any feedback, please send it to live@politico.eu. And thanks again so much for your time, Secretary of State. Much appreciated.
Thanks very much, Anna. Bye-bye.
Bye.